To gain more support for the war effort, the U.S. government used propaganda. The government created the Committee on Public Information. The CPI commissioned thousands of paintings, cartoons, sculptures, and posters to win public support for the war. In addition, the government needed to raise money for the war effort. They did this through raising taxes, but the public also helped finance the war on their own. Citizens loaned the government money by buying war bonds. The public helped the war effort by making sacrifices in other ways. The government created the Food Administration, which limited food sales to conserve for the troops. They called for wheatless Mondays, meatless Tuesdays, or for Americans to grow their own Liberty Gardens so that vegetables and fruits could go to the troops. The Fuel Administration called for gasless, heatless, and lightless days as well. Daylight savings time was created to conserve electricity by adjusting the clock to take advantage of more daylight during the summer months. The 18th Amendment is passed at this time as a part of a conservation effort to allow more food and fuel to be sent to soldiers on the front lines. It was also a moral issue. Germans were known drinkers, so if you drank, you were like them. Many of the companies that produced beer had ties to Germany. During World War I, the government takes control of the economy. President Wilson broadened the powers of the federal government by creating the War Industries Board, in which the government, labor, and industry became partners in producing the goods needed for war. The War Industries Board regulated the economy. It encouraged companies to use mass production techniques to increase efficiency and to eliminate waste by standardizing products. The National War Labor Board was created to handle labor disputes during World War I. Even though it opposed the disruption of war production by strikes, it did support an 8-hour day, equal pay for women, and the right to organize unions and bargain collectively. It attempted to discourage strikes with its work or fight motto. To help the war effort, Congress passed the Espionage and Sedition Acts. The Espionage Act made it a crime for a person to deliver information intended to interfere with the war effort or promote the success of the Central Powers. It ended up censoring the press. The Sedition Act punished anyone found guilty of making statements that interfered with the war, insulting the U.S. government, or any other speech. It censored this speech and permitted the government to open private citizens' mail and read, censor, or confiscate it before they received it. In Schenck versus U.S., a man was sent to prison for distributing anti-draft flyers. The Supreme Court ruled that any speech that presented a clear and present danger could be prosecuted with the full force of the law. In addition, labor leader and former presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs was sent to jail for criticizing President Wilson's support of the war. Civil liberties were the first victims of the war in the United States. The war brought great opportunities for women. While men went off to war, women moved into their jobs in the factories and coal mines. They also filled traditional jobs, such as nurses. Public opinion turned so much in women's favor that Congress finally passed the 19th Amendment in 1919, giving women the right to vote. It was ratified by the states in 1920 and became law. The flu epidemic of 1918, also known as the Spanish flu or influenza, killed more people than World War I did. It is believed to have killed 30 million people worldwide, 500,000 in the U.S. alone. World War I, by contrast, took 22 million lives. No one knew how to treat or defeat it. The only thing that doctors could think to do was to quarantine people and keep them clean. And then in 1919, just like it came, it just disappeared. Some think that it was the soldiers coming home from the war that spread the disease. The war also brought opportunities for African Americans. Look at the chart in the map. Where are most of these cities located? That's right, the North. What's happening to their population between 1910 and 1920? It's increasing at an enormous rate. Why were blacks fleeing the South? What were they trying to get away from? The Jim Crow laws. This was known as the Great Migration. First, we had to get our forces and supplies over to Europe. German U-boats had sunk twice as much ship tonnage as the Allies had built. The U.S. finally convinced the British to use a convoy system. A convoy is when merchant ships are escorted by a heavy guard of destroyers back and forth across the Atlantic. By the fall of 1917, shipping losses had been cut in half. Second, World War I ushered in new and improved weapons. Airplanes and tanks brought in mechanized warfare, or warfare that relies on machines powered by gasoline and diesel engines. At first, airplanes were used solely for scouting. Later on in the war, when Germans learned how to use and interrupt their gear for the propellers, they were used for dogfights. The British finally used them for bombing factories and army bases. Just like planes, tanks weren't used well either. By 1917, the British had learned to use large number of tanks to drive through barbed wire defenses, clearing the way for infantry. The machine gun was refined and changed the nature of warfare. What else do you notice about the picture? The gentlemen in the picture are wearing gas masks. A yellow-green chlorine fog sickened, suffocated, burned, and blinded its victims. The Germans used poison gas, and then the British eventually used poison gas during World War I. The American Expeditionary Force was led by General John J. Pershing. Remember, he almost got us into a war with Mexico when he chased Pancho Villa across the border. The AEF was our army. The AEF was intended to serve as reinforcements for the Allies, but Pershing urged that they serve as a separate union. Russia, or now the Soviet Union, pulled out of the war in 1917 after its second revolution turned it into a communist nation. This allowed the Germans to shift all of its forces to the Western Front. The Germans got within 50 miles of Paris when they were pushed back by the AEF. The AEF proved decisive in battle after battle. The hero of the war was an American named Alvin York. He started the war as a conscientious objector, a person who opposes warfare on moral grounds. He refused to fight because the Bible says, "Thou shalt not kill." He eventually decided it was okay to fight if the cause was just. Because of his heroic actions in the Battle of Argonne Forest, York earned the Congressional Medal of Honor. The Battle of Argonne Forest proved to be a turning point when Pershing and the AEF were able to push the Germans back into Germany. This victory was a major cause of the armistice that would soon be signed by the Germans. In November of 1918, Austria-Hungary surrendered to the Allies. That same day, German sailors mutinied against the government. The mutiny spread quickly, the Kaiser was overthrown, and a new German republic was formed. Although there were no Allied soldiers on German soil, the Germans were too exhausted to continue. At the 11th hour, on the 11th day, in the 11th month of 1918, Germany agreed to a ceasefire and signed the armistice, or truce, that ended the war. That day was called Armistice Day. Today, we call it Veterans Day. President Woodrow Wilson came up with a 14-point plan for a lasting world peace. He wanted a peace without victory. His points were divided into 3 groups. The first set addressed the issues of how to prevent another war. Among its provisions was that there should be no secret treaties. He also called for freedom of the seas for every country and not just those with strong navies to protect themselves. He also called for a reduction in arms to the point where each country had just enough to protect themselves. This way they couldn't use it as a diplomatic tool. Here he's referencing the militarism that helped cause the war. The second group dealt with boundary changes. Most importantly, Wilson believed that people should decide for themselves if they wanted to become their own nation. This is known as self-determination. Remember, Serbia and Bosnia and Austria-Hungary were fighting over their borders. Maybe if the Serbians inside of Bosnia had a choice which country they want to be a part of, the entire war could have been avoided. The last point called for the creation of a League of Nations. It would be an international organization to address diplomatic crises like those that sparked World War I. It would provide a forum for nations to discuss and settle their grievances without having to resort to war. Wilson took his plan with him to Versailles, where the 4 biggest democracies, the US, Britain, France, and Italy, met to write up a treaty. No one else was invited, not the Central Powers nor Russia, who was now a communist country. Wilson thought that everyone would love his plan. He was a celebrity throughout Europe for the role that America played in ending the war. He failed to realize just how much everyone hated Germany. He ended up giving up on every point in his plan except for the League of Nations. The Big Four carved up Europe and created new nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, as well as shifting boundaries for others, splitting up Austria and Hungary. There were 3 main weaknesses with the Treaty of Versailles. The first is that it humiliated Germany. It contained a war guilt clause that made them admit sole responsibility for starting World War I. This meant that they had to pay reparations or war damages of $33 billion to the Allies. There's no way that Germany could ever pay that since their colonies were taken away from them in the treaty. The second was it not only excluded the Soviet Union, or Russia, from the peace talks, but it took land away from them and created new countries. 9 new nations were formed in Europe. Both of these weaknesses will lead to the beginning of World War II. Number 1 leads to the downfall of the German Republic and the rise of Hitler, while the Soviet Union spends the next 20 years trying to get back its land, which happens with World War II. The third weakness is back home in the US. Wilson was so busy trying to convince Europe to accept his plan that he forgot to get approval from the Senate back home. Republican senators feared that by joining the League of Nations, we would be giving up our right to pursue our own foreign policy. If we want to declare a war on a country, we shouldn't have to answer to anyone but Americans. The Senate never approved the treaty. In fact, Wilson would die trying to convince Americans to pressure their senators to vote for it. He set out on an 8,000-mile tour, giving 34 speeches in about 3 weeks. He suffered a stroke and died 2 months later. We would later sign a separate treaty with Germany. The economic impact of World War I on the U.S. were lasting. Once again, the U.S. increased its overseas investments, contributing to a decade of tremendous economic growth. Second, wartime regulatory agencies would be adopted in the 1930s to help combat the Great Depression. Finally, the wartime policies on the home front would be repeated during the Second World War due to their successes.